Hi, I'm Jesse Balanik, and this is the presentation which accompanies my paper titled Overcoming Differing Culturally Embedded Understandings of Education Between Teachers. It is often assumed that if people speak the same language, that effective communication will necessarily occur. This is expected to remain true even if the language used is not the first language of one of the interlocutors, provided the linguistic competence of the second language speaker is sufficient. Therefore, people are often mystified by misunderstandings and miscommunications that are not caused by linguistic failures. If both interlocutors understand all the words, how can there be any misunderstanding? For example, the word student in English and its equivalent haksang in Korean are widely understood by both Korean and English speakers who work together in Korean public schools. Both words refer to a person who attends school for the purpose of learning. So when asking any English teacher in a Korean public school, Westerner or Korean, to point to a student, there will be total agreement. However, this surface level understanding belies a hidden disconnect in the deeper meaning of the word student. For Korean English teachers and native speaking English teachers, it turns out the meaning of student is significantly different. It is this deeper level of meaning and understanding that this project aims to examine. One question this project hopes to answer is, how is culture related to meaning and communication? To answer that question, we have to answer a simpler question first. What is culture? There are two views of culture. The received view. Dwight Atkinson describes the received view of culture that sees culture as geographically distinct entities, as relatively unchanging and homogeneous, and as all-encompassing systems of rules or norms that substantially determine personal behavior. You could say that Japanese culture is defined by things like language, religion, cultural practices, as well as food, music and clothing, and unique behaviors. When thinking of culture in this way, it's somewhat easy to draw clear lines and distinctions between cultures. The received view also suggests that all people who share a culture will behave in more or less the same way. Unfortunately, the received view of culture doesn't really help us in understanding how people understand things differently. The non-standard view of culture aims to avoid these simple distinctions and oversimplifications. According to Kubota, in these perspectives, a certain culture is not a monolithic, fixed, neutral, or objective category, but rather a dynamic organism that exists in discursive fields in which power is exercised. She goes on to argue, this understanding of the discursive nature of the knowledge of cultural differences questions the oversimplified generalizations of language and culture that appear in the recent applied linguistics literature. Now, Kubota was writing this back in 1999, but I think it remains true today. The term discursive refers to the concept of discourse articulated by Michel Foucault. Conceptualizing culture and cultural differences as an effect of a particular discourse allows us to examine the actual roots of intercultural misunderstandings that are not caused by linguistic failures. That leads us to another question. What is discourse? When speaking of discourse, in the Foucaultian sense, it is important to note we're not talking about dialogue or people talking. Discourse is a system of thought. For example, in The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault argues that medical discourse underwent a radical transformation during the 18th century as doctors began to see the body in different ways. So you have an example in the early 18th century of medical practices such as bloodletting and leeches, but by the late 18th century, doctors were using dissections to examine the actual causes of a disease. You could imagine that a doctor from the late 18th century rather, would have trouble talking to a doctor from the early 18th century because they don't have the same taken for granted assumptions about medical practice. Foucault identified 4 discursive formations. objects, enunciative modalities, concepts, and strategies. In educational discourse, student is an example of an object. Others may include teacher, teaching, learning, and education. Enunciative modalities are positions from which people can speak and have what they say be considered to have some authority. For example, a doctor is considered to be able to speak with authority regarding medical matters within medical discourse. This means that what a doctor says about health-related matters is considered to be more authoritative than what a non-doctor might say. Teachers have a similar claim to authority within educational discourse. Concepts are organizations of the other discursive formations within a discourse. For example, how the objects of teaching and learning are related is defined by discursive concepts. We will see the relationship between these two particular objects differs between Korean and Western educational discourse. Finally, strategies are the most superordinate of the discursive formations and represent complex systems of thought within a discourse. Communism and capitalism can be considered two different strategies within modern political economic discourse. At one level, they are based on many of the same assumptions, such as the scarcity of resources and the centrality of labor to production. However, capitalism and communism organize those assumptions in radically different ways and therefore make different claims regarding the political economy. This presentation will focus primarily on objects and concepts. The relevant enunciative modality of teacher ought to be kept in mind throughout, as I'll discuss how teachers speak to one another and understand or misunderstand each other. It is important to remember that two teachers generally possess the same claim to authority within educational discourse. Now I'd like to present an example of differing discourses. In late 2008, I interviewed 10 teachers who were teaching in the Korean public school system, 5 Western native-speaking English teachers and 5 Korean English teachers. I examined 5 objects of educational discourse: teachers, students, teaching, learning, and education. I discovered that there were significant differences between how these objects were conceptualized between the two discourses. For the sake of this presentation, I will only present 2 examples of discursive difference. Object differences. I mentioned earlier that while there may be a shared understanding of the meaning of the word student, the word actually refers to 2 different objects in Korean educational discourse and native English speaker educational discourse. For Korean English teachers, the concept of student is more holistic. It's more similar to the dictionary definition of the word youth in English than to student. It includes intrinsic traits of the student, including their age, their social status, and other factors. For native-speaking English teachers, the object student is limited in its relevance to the person in the classroom, not their age or family background or how they interact with their friends outside the classroom. This difference leads to a disconnect between which students are classified as good students by Korean and native-speaking English teachers. Korean teachers are more likely to take into account a multitude of factors in defining who is a good student, whereas native-speaking English teachers are more likely to only pay attention to the individual's in-class behavior. Concept differences. The way the objects teaching and learning are related in 2 discourses is also very different. For Korean English teachers, the objects of teaching and learning are necessarily connected, with learning requiring teaching to occur. When asked about the best way to learn something new, none of the Korean teachers described a situation of self-directed learning. They all described a situation involving a teacher. On the other hand, native English-speaking teachers, teaching and learning were separable. When asked the same question, 4 out of 5 native-speaking English teachers described a process of self-learning. Furthermore, 4 out of 5 native speaker English teachers described an example of learning a new skill when describing how to learn something new, whereas all the Korean English teachers I interviewed described a situation of learning knowledge rather than a skill. These differences in how Korean English teachers and native-speaking English teachers conceptualize teaching and learning leads to different preferences in teaching styles and methodology, and also the application of differing criteria to judge what makes a particular lesson good or bad. Korean English teachers tend to favor and view positively teacher-centered lessons where there is overt transfer of knowledge and information, whereas native-speaking English teachers tend to prefer student-centered lessons which focus on skill building. Passing theory. In order to overcome these discursive differences requires teachers to actively develop a discursive passing theory which will relate the other person's discourse to one's own. A passing theory is a concept borrowed from linguistics and described by Noam Chomsky in New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind. Basically, a passing theory is a theory that is unconsciously developed by interlocutors when engaged in dialogue. The passing theory allows each interlocutor to relate the linguistic information generated by the other party to their own internal language. Here's an example. Imagine a conversation between two people, Peter and Mary. Let's assume Peter is a native of London, England, and Mary grew up in New York City, USA. Let's further assume that both Peter and Mary speak English as their first language. When Mary says to Peter that she has a box in the trunk of her car, Peter examines Mary's statement and, based on his knowledge of American English, assumes that the word trunk in Mary's statement has the same meaning as the word boot in his I language or internal language. Thus, Peter creates a passing theory that equates boot to trunk. By constructing this passing theory, Peter can comprehend Mary's statement. In contrast, when Peter says to Mary that he heard her car make a strange noise and she should check under the bonnet, if Mary does not have an awareness of the differences between British and American English, she is unable to construct an effective passing theory and therefore cannot understand Peter's statement. This is an example of how passing theory works to facilitate communication in linguistics. My presentation and paper argue that discursive passing theories can be employed as a method to overcome communication failures that are not based on linguistic differences but discursive differences. When discursive difference is the cause of misunderstandings, the situation is reversed. The same words are used, but the meaning of the words differs. This is why miscommunications which result from discursive differences can be so mystifying. Unlike linguistic passing theories, which are developed automatically and unconsciously by participants in a dialogue, discursive passing theories must be actively and consciously developed. The first requirement to developing a discursive passing theory is to be aware of the effect that discourse can have on communication. At this point in the presentation, you should satisfy this requirement. The second requirement is to recognize when miscommunications may be a result of discursive differences rather than linguistic failures or problems. And finally, when participants recognize that a discursive difference has caused a miscommunication, it is important to engage in an open dialogue for the purpose of exposing and understanding the differing discourses. For example, say two teachers observed the same lesson where the students were engaged in active dialogue about their plans for the weekend. The teacher didn't provide any overt instruction at the beginning of the lesson, just set the task, then circulated the classroom and individually encouraged the students, offering corrections when required and information as requested. A Korean English teacher may have a negative view of this lesson because there was no overt knowledge transfer from teacher to student, and the majority of the class time was taken up by students talking without much structure. In contrast, a native-speaking English teacher might have a positive view of this lesson because the students were actively engaged in a skill-building exercise. In order to understand why one teacher felt the lesson was good while the other felt it was bad, both teachers should engage in a dialogue about why they felt it was good or bad. In so doing, both teachers should actively try to understand the fundamental criteria that people use to judge the lesson, and the discourse, in other words. By so doing, differences in discourse between how teaching and learning are conceptualized would be eliminated and a pathing theory could be developed.